What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Latin American politics. My apologies that we're getting started a little bit late. Uncharacteristically, I'm running a little bit behind, but I am here, as are you, and I'm so happy that you're here. To get started tonight, I actually want to talk briefly about Latin America and the news. Many of you have maybe noticed that Peru is in the headlines because in the course of about a week and a half, the Peruvian Congress impeached the president. A new president, an interim president, took office and then quickly stepped down. And the country is kind of embroiled in chaos. And all of this was brought about through mass protests against the impeachment of the president, Vizcarra. And the impeachment of Vizcarra, which kind of set off the protests that brought about the resignation of the interim president, was itself sort of payback for Vizcarra dissolving the Congress about a year ago. Now, although what he did was controversial, it was legal. It was within his purview as president. The problem in Peru, but also Venezuela to some degree too. But the problem in Peru is really much bigger than not having a president. And the problem goes to the absence of an organized party system. Now, as you know well, Peru doesn't have what we would describe as an institutionalized party system. Instead, it has a very disorderly and fragmented and weakly institutionalized party system where parties come and go. They don't have consistent ideologies. And in general, they're ruled by personalities and individuals as opposed to stable rules or some core platform or ideology that underpins the party. And so this very weakly institutionalized party system produces a lot of undemocratic and destructive outcomes. And in this article, written by Patricio Navia, who is actually a faculty member at the Catholic University in Chile, where I myself was a visiting researcher for about 4 months, there's a lot of discussion of those parties and those weak parties. And the system in Peru is actually not that unique by Latin American standards, because remember that in Latin America, as you know, party systems are relatively weak and relatively fragmented. Even in a country like Chile, where two coalitions appear to be relatively stable, there are in fact numerous political parties that fall underneath those individual coalitions. And so these weak, unstable political parties and systems throughout the region have been very incompatible with stable democratic government because they don't produce the kinds of orderly and stable outcomes that we would hope for. Peru is just an extreme case. And so this is an example of how what we discuss in class becomes really important in the real world. Now, these protests in Peru have resulted in multiple deaths. They've involved heightening the powers of the armed forces and the security forces. And in general, they've shown the weakness of democratic institutions in the dysfunction of those institutions in particular. And so the situation in Peru is real, and it's not just an academic exercise. It's a very real and very serious situation. Before we continue, does anyone have any comments or any thoughts on the situation in Peru?
I mean, this is less about Peru and more of a general Latin American comment. I just really like the sort of warning that the dissolution of political parties in Latin America represents for people who talk about how in the United States, just as an example, people should like separate ideologically and divide further into parties. So I just think it's really interesting that one of the core issues for Latin America, as was stated in the article, is like the lack of these cohesive political parties.
Yeah, you sort of get like the other extreme. You know, it's like, well, what happens when there are too many parties? And what happens when there's too much diversity? It's kind of one of the cruel ironies of the region. Diversity is sort of the promise, the treasure, as well as the peril, because when there's so much fragmentation and there are so many cleavages that cut across region and ethnicity or origin, language, it becomes sort of dysfunctional beyond correction. And the situation in Peru is an extreme example, but it goes to show you that you may critique the simplicity of the two-party system without fully appreciating some of the risks involved in having too much diversity. And so I think that maybe there's somewhere in the middle. And I, for one, don't actually critique the two-party system that much. I think that the institutions are set up in other ways that are equally corrosive, but we won't get into that. The point is, we all have an opinion, and oftentimes the real world is more complicated and more complex than maybe we anticipate. How you find a way in the middle is sort of a question for all of us. And so we're going to return to where we were on Monday, and that was in a discussion about the politics of inequality. And I just want to bring your attention back to these sort of founding notable facts that we began with. Many of you expressed some disbelief that these were all true statements. And I don't blame you, because I actually was surprised myself when I learned that Latin America is the most unequal region in the world. It is true that sub-Saharan Africa, some countries do exhibit more extreme inequality, but on the whole, Latin America as a region, the individual countries do exhibit higher inequality than countries anywhere else in the world. And this has to do, interestingly, with the combination of relatively well-developed economies, industrialized economies, and very, very dense urban centers where a lot of people are in the informal sector or don't work in the sort of legal or kind of traditional or conventional part of the economy. And so you have then the combination of very rich people who benefit from buying up privatized utility companies like these plutocrats in Mexico, with very poor people who don't benefit from protections provided by the state, which are often meager. And so in Santiago, Chile, for example, you could find yourself downtown in very, very rich, opulent places, and you can drive 45 minutes or an hour outside of the city to San Bernardo, which is in the metropolitan area, and find thatched roof homes where people burn wood to try to stay warm and sell flowers on the side of the road if they can. And that's just the custom. The point is, there's really radical inequality, and the countries themselves exhibit both extraordinary progress on the one hand, but also a lot of delayed development on the other hand in the form of poverty and inequality. And what's interesting is that this is the case despite more than 30 years of democratic politics. And so leftist governments in particular have not been able to substantially redistribute income in the region. And so there are real questions about the effectiveness of democracy from the point of view of cutting into some of those extreme inequalities that are so embedded in the region. In general, these issues are taken seriously by policymakers as well as the international community, but there are very serious political realities to contend with, mainly the fact that the beneficiaries of these very unequal circumstances are also the ones who are the best positioned to resist reforms that would redistribute income. And so in a country like Chile, for instance, the system is basically set up to protect the interests of very rich people who control most of the land and most of the investment capital in the country. And this is like 50 families. You know, it's a relatively small country, but the point is these 50 families benefit from the power of right-wing parties who traditionally have been very, very competitive and also benefit from elements of the Constitution that overextend their influence beyond what's, you know, proportional. The point is that these elites have defenders and are able to promote their interests in ways that make it difficult to redistribute income or pursue the kinds of policy reforms that would cut into inequality in the region. Despite this, economic development in the region has contributed to a rise in the middle class, but inequality is still declining slowly, and it's actually increasing in some countries. And so we're going to continue to frame the discussion using these facts, and we're going to use Brazil as a case that we can examine to see, in particular, the way that different perspectives work and how the picture looks on the ground. So this is a picture of Rio de Janeiro, and this is another depiction of that spatial inequality that I've talked so much about. Now in Brazil, these poor neighborhoods where people basically get power often illegally, or they don't have access to, say, plumbing or sources of water in the ordinary way that we would have access to it. They're called favelas. They're not called favelas elsewhere in Latin America, but they are in Brazil. But what's interesting about the favelas is that they run up right up against the rest of the city, which is often characterized by these more modern, well-to-do, often elegant high rises that seem to represent globalization and abundance and the benefits and the gains of globalization. But this spatial inequality is really symbolic and reflective of the inequality in the country at large, because in some ways, the absence of a middle class seems to characterize the picture. There is a large and growing middle class, but because of the extremes, that middle class is overshadowed by the gap between the wealthy and the poor masses. And it's not to say that there are that many wealthy. You'll see in a moment that the share of the overall society in most countries that would constitute the super wealthy or the upper class is relatively small. It's just that that tiny class controls the economy and controls politics. And so they've got relationships with political parties and institutions that far outweigh anything that could ever be mustered by the poor masses, despite that the poor masses can vote in much larger numbers on election day. Now, at this point, you're probably asking, you know, what is inequality and what are its consequences? This is a lecture about the politics of inequality. And so understanding what it is essential first and foremost. And so these are the definitions that we're going to work with in this class. And these are definitions that have been used in studies on inequality in Latin America. Socioeconomic inequality we will define as the extent to which income and resources are distributed unequally in a society. And this type of inequality is reflected in class structures and status hierarchies. And in particular, it's reflected in the size of the middle class relative to the size of the lower class and the upper class. And the middle class, relatedly, we will define as the set of four-member households in a society that possess disposable income between 67% and 200% of median household income in that society. So it's relative. That means that the middle class in Bolivia will be different than the middle class in Uruguay or Argentina. The middle class in Mexico will be different than the middle class in Colombia. because the median income levels in those societies differ, then their middle classes will differ as well. And so we can take a look first and foremost at inequality. And I really want to pause and focus on this graphic because this is a way for us to both see the differences between countries in the progress they've made, and then also see the averages for the region at large. So the measure that we're using here is the Gini index. The Gini index is basically a measure of income inequality that measures the frequency of different income levels in a society. And what you need to know to interpret this is that positive numbers in up to 100 equate to perfect inequality. So it means in one society, one person has everything and everyone else has nothing, theoretically. Negative 100 equates to perfect equality. And that would mean in one society, every person in that society has the same share of the overall pie. And what you'll see is that Peru has done the most over the period of 2000 to 2010 to reduce inequality. They reduced inequality by about 8 points. Mexico, Ecuador, and Argentina also made sizable gains, as did the Dominican Republic, Brazil, Paraguay, and El Salvador. Panama, Colombia, Bolivia, and Chile went less far, but also had gains. But then you get to countries like Honduras, Uruguay, Costa Rica, all of which actually saw an increase in inequality. And so these countries went in the opposite direction. They actually saw income and wealth be distributed more narrowly than broadly over this 10-year period. And so rich people got richer, poor people got poorer. And then the average for the region as a whole is relatively modest, but does show a decrease in inequality. The unweighted average, weighted according to population size, shows an even larger average. But the picture at large is that most countries remained or became more unequal during the 1990s, and then became slightly less unequal in the first decade of the 21st century. And so it's been a very slow process, but inequality is declining in the region. When you look at this data, do you find anything especially surprising, or does anything stand out to you?
I will have to say that the Mexican graph, where it shows that Mexico has been trying to avoid the inequality. It shows a higher percentage than I thought it would be because uh, I lived in Mexico before, and I've seen the poverty and the comparison of poverty and rich people, and it's kind of weird seeing how Mexico has actually tried to avoid that inequality.
Yeah, that's interesting to me too. And I'm also kind of curious to see Peru performing as well as it did. Ecuador surprises me less because Ecuador benefited a lot from oil revenue and particular economic reforms that helped to provide much stronger social policies and education and healthcare policies. Argentina has a very supportive state and a welfare state that is generous. And so I'm also not as surprised to see Argentina up here. But I don't know as much about Mexico. One hypothesis that I have, the more I think about it, is that maybe Mexico during this period grew relatively robustly because of the NAFTA trade agreement. And maybe it's possible that economic growth made it so that there were more benefits for the working and the middle classes. And maybe that helped to enlarge those classes and reduce inequality. But it's probably more likely that policy and government interventions in the form of specific redistributive policies, it's probably more likely that those policies and those factors are behind the reduction in inequality in Mexico. But if anyone knows the case and knows what went on in Mexico during this period, that would be interesting to talk about it. But it's definitely a surprising case. Brazil is also kind of surprising for reasons that we'll discuss here in a moment. But what's interesting is to note that some countries actually saw increases in inequality. And so Uruguay is one example, but there's more to the story. Uruguay is a country that never had much inequality to begin with. And so anytime an economy grows or develops further, and anytime there's a period of sustained growth, there probably will be increases in inequality because returns to capital usually outpace returns to workers during ordinary economic times. And so that means investors get richer than workers do. And so if you have a relatively equal economy in society and it grows at a good rate, it's very likely that you'll see increases in inequality. And still, in the big picture, there won't be a high level of inequality in the country. It's just that the growth of it during a certain period makes it look like there is. And so I think that that's what's going on in Uruguay. But Honduras is a country that's always been very unequal. And so I think that what is partially at work in Honduras is that Honduras had mostly right-wing governments during this period. And so whereas many of these countries in South America had leftist governments that did pursue redistributive policies, Honduras had a very different political environment. And so that might be what explains the situation in Honduras. I don't know enough about Costa Rica to remark about the case. Another way for us to look at inequality in a very descriptive way is to just look at the class composition of different countries. And again, we've got the countries ordered according to the size of the middle class, or in this case, the size of the middle class. The last slide, it was in terms of changes in inequality. But you'll see on the far right, Uruguay has the largest middle class. El Salvador has the smallest middle class on the far left. And countries in between are scattered in between in terms of where they are on the spectrum. Argentina and Chile both have very large middle classes. As does Uruguay, as does Costa Rica. You'll notice that these countries also vary considerably in the size of the poor. Honduras has a very, very large poor. On the other hand, Uruguay has a relatively small underclass, if you will. These changes matter a great deal because they affect participation in politics and a lot of other things that we'll discuss here in a moment. But these data show us another way of looking at inequality and the class structures that define inequality. Now, inequality has a number of consequences that are relatively serious, and I say relatively, but that's really an understatement. Inequality has been identified as one of the most corrosive forces of all because of how encompassing and structural it is, and how systematically it operates to reduce opportunities for entire swaths of people in society who could be very usefully mobilized in a productive way if a more equitable distribution of assets and income and wealth characterized the picture. And so this is just a very short list of some of the more serious consequences, but be assured that it's a much longer list if we take into consideration all of the different consequences that arise. So first and foremost, very unequal societies grow at slower rates. They exhibit lower long-term GDP growth rates. And the reason is because think of it like machinery that could be in use. Now, we don't want to refer to people as machinery, but when you have an entire society and a huge swath of that society is working in low income or informal or precarious employment, you're not making full use of all of the potential or the capacity to be productive in that society. And you're also disproportionately concentrating a lot of the resources and the money in the hands of a few people who will only buy so many boats or so many refrigerators or microwaves, and who will only invest so much of that money productively or in a way that will actually grow the society. It makes so much more sense from the perspective of growth to redistribute that money more evenly so that everyone has a fair shot, and so that more importantly, they can invest that productively, and so that that whole society can buy as many microwaves and refrigerators and make as many investments as they ordinarily could for the purpose of creating a more dynamic economy. And so that's a very gross simplification of the situation. But the point is that when you have a society characterized by these inequalities, you miss a lot of opportunities that would otherwise exist to create growth. Now, relatedly, this also results in very high rates of crime. In a lot of societies, inequality and poverty contribute to high crime rates because people stuck in poverty don't have an alternative. And so they get involved in organized crime or gang activity. In Latin America, that sometimes relates to producing or trafficking drugs, getting involved in organized crime that's related to narco trafficking, or there are really, really sophisticated gangs that also draw on those who are precariously employed or who are impoverished and who suffer as a result of this inequality. And throughout the region, crime rates are a serious challenge. Murder rates are higher in Honduras than they have ever been, and they're higher there than anywhere in the world, and it's closely tied to inequality. And relatedly, there are very poor public health outcomes. And I'll show you in a moment how, for example, inequality affects responses to COVID-19 and how countries are kind of hamstrung in a way by the consequences of inequality and poverty and an inequitable distribution of resources. For example, underfunded hospitals or social services or public services that rely on property taxes and that are underfunded in poor neighborhoods. There's also increased political inequality that results. This is an important, very, very important consequence because individuals and groups who are in poverty or who don't enjoy the benefits of economic activity and growth are not able to exercise basic rights and liberties and to participate in the democratic process. That undermines the legitimacy of the process in the eyes of those who don't benefit from it or who can participate in it. And it produces outcomes that are not beneficial to those actors because the system need not respond to them. And so political inequality is a very corrosive consequence. In Latin American countries, political inequality is closely tied to economic inequality, and it's one of the reasons that oftentimes people in politics are very, very rich, and why ordinary people often have a very dim view of, for example, Congress, because Congress is often responsive primarily to wealthier constituencies in the same way that they are in the United States, realistically speaking. Inequality also produces lower average education levels. And so societies that are very unequal are also societies that are very disparate in terms of literacy, in terms of education, completion rates, etc. So we're going to watch a video that exhibits the impact of political inequality in Brazil, and it uses the case of the Olympics in Rio de Janeiro as sort of a case study. And it looks in particular at how economic interests and powerful economic interests sort of use their influence to shape the decision-making process in their favor, despite that it would be very harmful to poor people in Rio de Janeiro and people who live in favelas and who've primarily called the city at home but don't benefit from the benefits of globalization in the way that the elites do. So we'll go ahead and watch this video and take a look at it before we get back together.
When you leave the international airport of Rio de Janeiro and head towards the south of the city, which is where all the beaches are, you pass a sprawling informal settlement called Mare. It's one of hundreds of neglected shanty towns like this in Rio. It goes on for miles. But when you pass by there today, all you see is this wall. This map of Rio. Here's the part that you probably know. It's the South Zone. It's where all the iconic beaches are. Mare is in Rio's North Zone, which is where most of the city's poor live.
A barreira acústica, a ideia, segundo eles, era para poder barrar o som, porém, é nítido que essa barreira, o único intuito dela é para quê? Para que as pessoas que saem do aeroporto do Galeão e vão sentido a Zona Sul não consigam ver a realidade da cidade.
They don't have sewage systems, they don't have housing rates, they don't have anything. But, you know, the city is really concerned about how loud the cars are because they're worried about, you know, the ears of the poor people that don't have food in their stomach.
The city just installed a big new school in this community a few months ago. You'll note that when we get to this part of the highway, the wall becomes totally transparent, giving us a perfect view of the shiny school. Every time international attention comes to Rio, the city scrambles to build up infrastructure around tourism for visitors to see that it's this amazing city. The problem is the visitors will come and they go, but the people of Rio are here to stay. And they're frustrated. They're frustrated that their government will spend so much money to build up certain parts of the city and completely neglect others. The Olympics is no different in this case. In fact, it's probably the biggest excuse Rio has to pour tons of money into making the city look good. This is Patricia. She rides the buses here in Rio and has noticed a major change in the bus routes recently.
It used to be a line who left Ramos, who is in the North Zone, to Cosme Velho, where we have the Christ. And this line was distinguished.
Patricia is showing me a few examples of the 11 bus lines that were cut between the poor North Zone and the touristy rich South Zone, all in preparation for the Olympics. It's now much harder for a resident of the North Zone to get down to the beaches of Ipanema or Copacabana. So why cut the bus line?
If all of these black people, poor people, barefoot people are there, like, no, we have to clean this. And they always wanted to clean, but now they have a purpose, they have a deadline to do this.
If discriminatory bus lines are bad, here's where it gets worse. So back to this map. Out here in the west is a place called Baja. R's are pronounced like H in Portuguese. This is a new part of the city where a lot of the Olympics action is happening. It's where the Olympics Park is going to be built. And because of this, it's home to what one real estate publication is calling a cosmopolitan awakening. Tons of real estate investment. And of course, a bunch of dramatic promotional videos to go with it. There's this one guy named Carlos Carvalho. He's a real estate developer, and he owns 64 million square feet in Baja. Last year, in a series of interviews with big publications, Carvalho sketched out his dream for Baja. His goal is to turn this place into a new Rio, a city for the elite, of good taste, noble housing, not housing for the poor. This guy's the 12th richest person in Brazil, and he's got a ton of political influence to make his dream happen. Here he is with Rio's mayor, whose re-election campaign he generously donated to. They're just, looking over plans for how they're going to reshape Baja. But there's one big problem for people like Carlos Carvalho and his dream to make Baja a haven for the rich.
If your interest is in land value, the less poor people you have in your land, the greater value you can give it to it. They think of the city as a place for you to invest in, not a place for you to live in.
Over the years, little settlements of a few hundred families have popped up in Baja. It's usually workers unable to find affordable housing and creating communities of their own. These places have been around for decades, and many of them have gained legal status for their property. But to the luxury-minded developers of this new part of town, these informal settlements represent a barrier to their plan. So when the Olympic Park was planned for this area of Rio, it wasn't much of a surprise when the city came in with eminent domain eviction orders, telling these communities that they would be moved to public housing complexes, usually far out of sight of any international visitors. Most communities left, some happily taking the money that the city gave them. Some mounted intense but failed resistance. But I visited one community that didn't give up on the fight to keep their homes.
Quando falaram que as Olimpíadas ia ser no Rio de Janeiro, nós já sabíamos que o nosso problema ia aumentar.
Villa Autódromo was a community of around 600 families near where the Olympic Park is being built. It's not on the actual park property, but it's in the site of the park. This is what it looks like today.
People chose to go there because there was no drug trafficking or militia. It was very safe, very good sense of community, near jobs, near schools. It's hard to know that when you just visit the community, but you kind of get a sense of that by seeing the people who are still resisting, because they're holding on to that memory and they want to keep some of that alive.
After years of fighting with the city hall, only 20 families of the original 600 remain in this community. Fierce protesting and a flurry of international press got the mayor to finally concede, saying that the 20 families could stay on condition that the city would build them nicer looking homes, lest, heaven forbid, the international community catch a glimpse of the real Rio.
Tínhamos árvores frutíferas que nos alimentavam, que nós plantamos, não vamos ter que refazer isso tudo novamente. Cada canto daquela casa foi construído com muito carinho, as árvores, as plantas.
O que impede a Vila Autódromo de permanecer do lado do Parque Olímpico? É alguma razão urbanística? Não, não é. É uma razão uma razão dos interesses econômicos que estão ligados à valorização imobiliária. Não tem outra razão.
Apesar de eu ter me preparado antes, eu sabia que um dia minha casa ia ter que ser demolida, mas para mim esse período foi o pior momento de toda a luta.
Through the long fight, some of Villa Autódromo was able to stay. But this is rare. Most communities that receive eviction orders no longer exist. At least 77,200 people have been removed from their homes in Rio de Janeiro since 2009. That's according to government data. And much of this is to make way for infrastructure and real estate projects associated with the World Cup and the Olympic Games.
So it's kind of a shame because the Olympics ends up coming in and kind of whitewashing areas and creating and reframing them. And, you lose a lot of the personality of the city.
Of course, there have been numerous benefits to the people of Rio thanks to the Olympics investments. New bus lines, revitalizations of old parts of the city, museums, parks. This stuff will make life better in the city for sure. But in the end, billions of public dollars that were supposed to benefit the people ended up bowing to the interests of a few people with a lot of money. And instead of investing in the underserved, Rio will once again hide them from view.
So the Olympics in Brazil kind of highlight the inequality, and in particular how the inequality gives rise to political influence for elites who shape decisions in their favor. And in this case, that decision involved kind of sort of moving or kind of dislocating poor neighborhoods that were in eyesight of the event locations for the Olympics. And so moving them would be favorable to these elites and to the real estate values of these investments. And so that was what was done. Although in this case, there was the added twist that the poor were able to defend themselves and ultimately obtain some concessions. But the story of inequality in Brazil is, again, often this story of elite economic interests shaping the decision to allocate money a certain way or make certain kinds of investments and so on and so forth. And this is how inequality becomes so consequential politically, because it reproduces itself through decisions that promote the interests of the beneficiaries of the already unequal circumstances. And so Brazil is one example. There are many examples, but let's continue to talk about Brazil. And one way to talk about Brazil is to focus on the impact of COVID-19 and how inequality has sort of exposed the ways that COVID-19 and other kinds of crises disproportionately affect the poor, and how they are often more difficult to grapple with, and how crises often last longer. In a lot of ways, COVID-19 has exposed Latin America's inequality. And so we'll watch a video here through Al Jazeera, and then in a moment, come back to this.
Life almost appears to be back to normal in Rio de Janeiro. The return of crowds to public beaches, however, doesn't mean things are improving. Despite an easing of restrictions, Brazil remains the country worst affected by coronavirus in all of Latin America. While the worsening outbreak in Brazil is an extreme example, other Latin American countries are also struggling to contain the virus. Health officials say widespread inequality have made the crisis worse.
We know that Latin America is the most inequitable region in the world, and also one of the most urbanized regions in the world. So we have big cities like Rio, Sao Paulo, Lima, in where they are surrounded by a belt of poverty and inequities. So the same lockdown that was applied in Europe to a certain extent cannot be completely applied in Latin America and the Caribbean.
In Mexico, authorities say they expect the height of contagion to occur near the end of June. And despite the worsening health crisis, the government has begun a gradual reopening of the economy. Health workers say this is a worrying sign.
Obvio, es la preocupación de todos.
Obviously, everyone is worried to see that people are basically going about their normal lives. And being in the health sector, you know the consequences that will have. So we're hoping that this doesn't go on too long, but at the end of the day, we know what the consequences will be.
Another hard-hit country is Peru, which neared 200,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19 on Tuesday. Hospitals in the capital, Lima, are nearing a breaking point. The country's president, Martín Vizcarra, paid his respects to the 52 health workers who died in the fight against coronavirus.
The situation, as we all know, is a very difficult and complex one because this disease has caught us in a situation with a precarious health system with many needs.
Latin America was the last region to be hardest hit by the coronavirus, and now health officials warn it could take longer to recover than other parts of the world. Manuel Rapalo, Al Jazeera.
So the problem with inequality is that every other crisis makes it worse. So when there's a pandemic, it disproportionately affects the poor. It puts inordinate pressure on the health system, and it does so in a way that is often more difficult to deal with and takes longer to deal with and is more expensive to deal with because of how these systems are often unprepared and because of how, in general, poor people don't often have access to what they need to survive the illness, to survive the disease. And so countries like Brazil show that inequality can be exacerbated by a crisis. In the United States, we've seen that minorities, and Blacks in particular, have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19. They're dying at higher rates, they're not surviving at higher rates, and they often have less access to healthcare if they fall ill with the disease. And so, in general, inequalities exacerbate and are exacerbated by other crises. And so, in the present day, Latin American countries are taking longer to deal with the crisis than other regions of the world because of the inequality. And so it does exhibit the impact of inequality, and it shows that, generally speaking, more unequal countries have a lot of problems that arise as a result of their inequality. Now, at this point, probably the most important question is, why does inequality vary? And why are some Latin American countries less unequal than others? Why is Uruguay, or why is Costa Rica, for example, more equal than Honduras or Chile or Mexico? How can we understand these differences systematically if we care so much about the distribution of income and wealth, and if it has such an effect on politics? We're going to focus on 4 perspectives on inequality in the middle class. These are 4 sets of arguments or explanations. We'll go through each of them one by one and look at examples and maybe watch some video footage that puts them in perspective. The first argument or set of arguments focuses on an inequality of opportunities that exists between people in a society. And the idea is that gender, economic circumstances, geography, ethnicity, and similar factors can trap people in poverty and do so in a way that is beyond their control. And these factors might differ from society to society, but they can matter a great deal when it comes to the differences between income groups in society and the distribution of income between them. The second perspective that we'll focus on focuses on financial globalization and the movement of capital across borders, and how the free movement of capital puts constraints on governments that might wish to redistribute income or promote policies that might be detrimental or disadvantageous to investors or capital owners because of either increases in taxation or rules that would make it less profitable for them to operate within the borders of the state. The third perspective that we'll focus on emphasizes tax and spending policy or fiscal policy. And this perspective emphasizes the type of tax system, whether it relies on progressive taxes or whether it relies on more regressive value added and consumption taxes. As you'll see, Latin American countries primarily use more regressive taxes, and it's also difficult to tax wealthier people and investors, and there's also a lot of tax evasion. And so as a result, for those reasons, as well as the fact that there's lower tax revenue as a whole, Latin American countries tend to fail to use fiscal policy effectively to redistribute income. And then finally, organizational fragmentation. This relates to how fragmented the party system is. And in a country like Peru, extensive fragmentation can impede redistributive reforms because it requires the cooperation and the agreement of a lot of different interest groups to agree on and enact redistributive reforms. And so organizational fragmentation can be lethal in that circumstance. Now, Brazil is the most unequal country, or one of the most unequal countries in Latin America. And it's also a good example of how inequality of opportunity can cause inequality in a country, and how differences in inequalities of opportunity can cause variation in inequality between countries. So when we talk about inequality of opportunity, we mainly mean circumstances beyond one's control, like father's and mother's education, race, birthplace, etc. And in one study, Brazil was found that these characteristics accounted for nearly half of the earnings inequality between males in urban Brazil in 1996. And so there's substantial evidence that these circumstances beyond one's control, these inequalities of opportunity, can contribute to variation in earnings between individuals. This is one perspective, but the problem with this perspective for us is that it doesn't give us a lot of insight into differences between countries. It tells us about inequality inside a country, but it doesn't tell us as much about variation between countries. The second perspective focuses on financial globalization and the free movement of capital. The idea is that when governments liberalize the capital account and allow foreign investors to make investments in the country, buy factories, start companies, etc., that makes it harder for the host government to pass policies that redistribute wealth and income. The logic being that those redistributive policies would be disadvantageous to those new foreign investors, and it would be disadvantageous or a disincentive for potential investors to invest their money. This is an interesting argument because it's obviously logical to say that investors want safe circumstances and good circumstances if they want to invest their money. But it's not clear that this is really the case, because governments get bargaining power in their relationship with multinational companies that develops over time. And those investors have a hard time just pulling out, especially if they've been there for a decade or more. But it is probably true that globalization reduces the policy options available to governments, especially if they're trying to redistribute wealth and income. And we know that in Latin American countries, globalization corresponded with democratic transitions and consolidation in the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s. And so many of these countries implemented neoliberal reforms at the same time that they transitioned to democracy. Why is that important? Because that might explain why democratic politics hasn't been successful at redistributing more income and wealth in the last 30 years. Countries like Peru are somewhat interesting because in Peru, the transition to democracy also corresponded with neoliberal reforms, but leftist governments since the 2000s were somewhat successful, even despite organizational fragmentation, in redistributing income and reducing inequality. The question of whether globalization affects the redistribution of wealth and income and the success of governments who pursue redistributive policies is still an unsettled question, but it's one perspective that helps us to understand some of the complexity in Latin America. Let's watch a video about that.
What exactly are the distributional effects of tax policy? One of the primary goals of governments is to reduce inequality and move people out of poverty. To achieve this, governments use the revenue that they generate to fund social programs. Now, how do governments generate revenue? By levying taxes on goods and income. Taxes provide governments a source of revenue so that they can fund programs such as cash transfers, pensions, and spending on education and health. However, taxes impose a burden on people, so depending on who pays taxes, they will have a different impact on poverty and inequality. Taxes are progressive if those who have more pay a larger share of their incomes. For example, income taxes usually have a higher tax rate for higher income individuals. They are regressive if the poor pay a larger share of their income in taxes. For example, if a poor person pays $10 in sales tax, this will represent a higher share of her budget than if a rich person pays the same $10. A progressive tax reduces inequality as long as it collects a sizable amount of money. However, a regressive tax can also reduce inequality if the money collected is then mostly used to benefit the poor. For instance, an increase in value-added taxes on goods could be bad for the poor. But if the revenues are used to fund social transfers for the poor, or construction of primary schools in poor areas, it can reduce inequality in the long run. Governments need to assess the short-term and long-term impacts of their tax and spending policies. For instance, cash transfers can bring immediate poverty relief, but spending on schools and hospitals could yield long-term benefits. How governments collect revenues and how those resources are ultimately spent determines the impact on poverty and inequality.
One of the challenges in Latin America is that governments get a lot of their tax revenue or get a disproportionate amount of their tax revenue from sales tax and consumption taxes. And so that means that the poor pay a larger proportion of their income in taxes than do the rich. When you combine that with the weakness of many state institutions, as well as the tax evasion of many elites, you get a system that disproportionately imposes the tax burden on the poor. That doesn't help to cut into inequality, that deepens inequality. And so in Latin America, some of the challenges to reducing inequality have to do with the weakness of state institutions and some of the policies that follow from some of those institutions. The fourth and final perspective on inequality that we'll focus on emphasizes organizational fragmentation. And this relates to really the nature of the party system. Brazil, as we already know, is an example of a fragmented party system. There are many, many parties. Take, for example, the distribution of seats in Congress in 2018. Each color represents a different political party. And you see immediately that there are many, many different colors. There were many, many different parties. This level of fragmentation has been linked to failed redistributive reforms. And in one study, for example, these types of splits kept Congress from adopting key redistributive tax, social, and education initiatives. And so what you have here is a situation where redistributive reforms that would reduce inequality are proposed, but they cannot be adopted because inter-party splits that are so numerous as a result of the fragmentation impede the adoption of those policies. And so I think a better question when facing these results is, does fragmentation prolong inequality? It's not a cause of inequality so much as it's a factor that prevents the reduction of inequality. It's a factor that prolongs inequality. Now, what's important to note at the same time is that Brazil has gone further than many other Latin American countries in reducing inequality, even despite some of these political challenges. And there are reasons for that that relate to politics and how presidents, increasingly since the 90s, have overcome fragmentation by stitching together coalitions. But one thing remains true, which is that generally speaking, fragmentation makes it harder to reduce inequality because controversial policy changes like redistributive reforms in tax, social, or education policy are difficult, and they require the consent of multiple interest groups who might have different political party representatives. And so fragmentation might be the single most important variable when we talk about inequality and the persistence of inequality in Latin America, because fragmentation has also persisted, as has inequality. And so the middle class has grown, but the political systems in many cases have remained relatively dysfunctional. So as we begin to reach a critical mass in this lecture, and as we begin to see these different perspectives and how they explain the Brazilian case, we arrive at a series of questions that I think help us to think about the different issues involved in this discussion. The first question is, how does democratic politics affect economic inequalities? The second question is, how do economic inequalities affect democratic politics? And the third question is, why should we care about inequality in Latin America? I think that the best place for us to start is the third question. Why should we care about inequality in Latin America or in general? Does anyone want to take on that question?
Well, I think in relation to I'll take the third one first, because of the way that the world is becoming more globalized. If the United States or the United States markets are able to send resources to different countries, it benefits US consumers by creating jobs for people in the country, and it helps avoid the economic costs of poverty while also creating more innovation in different parts of the world. And the second one is that, as we are seeing in countries such as Peru and Venezuela, if you aren't able to get represented in your government necessarily, or the Congress is impeaching a president for, I think it was like moral incapacity in the case of Peru,
right.
correct? Yeah. It sort of causes you to naturally become disillusioned with government because they're not doing anything for you.
Absolutely. So in the first case, it pays to create consumers, right? And that means giving people enough income to actually be able to participate in the economy as consumers. And relatedly, it helps to give them the means, or at least some platform, for innovation or the creation of human capital through the acquisition of skills, all of which can feed back into the economy in very productive ways and that are more long-term, right? So that's definitely true. But then also, there's the fact that inequality creates a risk of political inequality if people lose faith in democratic institutions because they become insufficiently responsive. That's absolutely true. And we see that in Peru, in the collapse of the party system, and then the sort of emergence of this very dysfunctional, disorganized, highly fragmented party system that barely exists, and where Congress can only agree on the impeachment of the president. These types of situations become very possible in a very unequal society. And so in Latin America, one of the biggest threats to democracy, as well as to economic growth, is inequality, because people are left out, so to speak. They're shut out of the system. They can't fully participate in the economy. They can't participate in politics. And so they become frustrated with democracy. They become frustrated with the economy, with capitalism. let's hear from some others. Why should we care about inequality? Why should we care about inequality?
Could one reason be because inequalities show the effect of, I think what you were saying was extreme, I don't know, extreme political, when there's a lot of a political party. So I guess there's going to be too many that there's going to be, not everyone's going to get what they want. So everyone's going to feel unequal. So I think that's one thing, one way we could see inequalities, other than the obvious, if there's just one big political party that has all the power for one social class. But that's just a different way of seeing it, I think. I don't know.
So it's possible, as Elvis suggests, that inequality will perpetuate a system where parties split up into all these separate camps. That's definitely possible if there's a lot of frustration among lower class people or those who don't benefit from the economy, and maybe they turn against each other, right? We can imagine that. There's, of course, more political instability in a society that's very unequal. And so that's very likely, I think. Delianor says inequality, one place usually ends up affecting another country. Look at Mexico in America, plus the wall Trump had built. So it's possible that inequality affects other countries too. This is something to consider. Maybe it's something that becomes consequential for other countries as well. We're out of time, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. I'll see you on Monday.